post-traumatic growth, dealing with shattered assumptions, rebuilding, looking at beneficial changes cognitively and emotionally, cognitively and affectively, following traumas. He's a pioneer in the field of post-traumatic growth, and he'll be looking at a number of outcomes in terms of post-traumatic growth, including greater appreciation of life, warmer, more intimate relationships with others, greater sense of personal strength, recognition of new possibilities and paths, and spiritual development. And co-presenting with him today will be Dr. Zippy Weiss, who is an adjunct professor at Adelphi University in New York, whose research work is on the impact of breast cancer on survivors and family and the concept of post-traumatic growth. And Joel Milam, is that correct? Research associate at the University of Southern California. So pleased to welcome you, and Dr. Paul Wong will be, I guess, a respondent at the end, at the conclusion of this presentation. So we welcome you and welcome our speakers. Thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity to address you today and to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And I want to start off by acknowledging the most important people to whom I owe a debt, and that is all the people I've talked to over the years who are survivors of traumatic events, who have informed me about their experiences and revealed to me that their experiences involve more than just the nastiness of trauma, but also transformations in themselves, very often as a result of trying to grapple with these events. I'm particularly indebted to bereaved parents that I work with. For the past 15 years, I've been facilitating support groups for bereaved parents through a nonprofit organization in Charlotte, North Carolina called Kindermourn. And those people have had a lot of things to teach me. And so I feel like a conduit, someone who is simply sharing with you a lot of what has been told to me by those bereaved parents and many other trauma survivors. However, we also want to talk with you today about some more empirical studies of post-traumatic growth. And so Zippy and Joel will get to some of those matters a little later on. I'm going to give you the conceptual framework for this, mention some empirical findings about post-traumatic growth, and then we'll share with you some studies they have recently completed that I think are very interesting examples of the kind of research that can be done in this area. And hopefully they will inspire you to do some work on your own in this area as well. During lunch today, Zippy and Joel and I were talking about how we got interested in this whole thing, and I mentioned to them that it started for me back in 1983 when I got tenure, and that's a very freeing experience. I decided maybe then I could finally do what I wanted to do, but I wasn't sure what that was. I found myself asking the question at that time, as a psychologist, what did I get into this field to do anyway? What was I interested in? What did I want to know? And I guess in a naive way, I wanted to know something about how to live well, how to live wisely. And psychology may not have been the proper place for me to go to find that out, but I decided I needed to take a real look at this area, which didn't support a whole lot of research or study at the time. And my colleague Lawrence Calhoun and I decided that one way we could find out about wisdom and living well was to talk to people who had gone through adversity and people who had somehow managed that particularly well. And maybe they had something to teach us. So that's where we got started with this. We went and talked to people who had experienced different kinds of physical disabilities, who had been paralyzed or blinded as a result of accidents and illnesses of various kinds, and had done very well in spite of these traumas that had befallen them. And as a result of our interviews with these people, we started on the path to conceptualizing how these traumatic events can produce some startlingly good outcomes for people, and the process by which that occurs, and how to measure them and whatnot. So today I want to give you an overview of where we stand in that regard today. I'm interested, before I get started though, on how many people have done some reading in the area of post-traumatic growth. Have you read it? Who has read something? Okay, some of you have. Well, that's good. The rest of you, you will not be lost because I'll be starting in fairly basic fashion. So in order to get started, I want to make it clear that I'm no Pollyanna about trauma. I don't believe that trauma is a wonderful thing to have happen to you so that you can grow. The stories I've heard from various people make it clear to me that trauma is something that none of us want to go through. But in spite of that, there are various kinds of outcomes we can see. If we start off with consideration of what makes events traumatic, there are certain things that traumatic events seem to have in common. They're usually, the most traumatic events are sudden, unexpected, and unusual events. They involve physical harm to oneself or someone else. People experiencing them as out of their control in some way. Blame is an essential element, either blame of self, I brought this on myself in some way, I made some terrible mistakes, I've created this terrible difficulty in my life, or someone else has visited this upon me. Even if that's God, it may not be an individual person. Long-lasting problems often result from severe traumas. And in certain stages of development, a person is more vulnerable to traumas, and perhaps a child might be more vulnerable to a trauma, an elderly person. So we consider where in psychological development these traumas occur. And of course, we know there are negative effects of trauma. PTSD, we're all familiar with as probably the most common. DSM-1 axis 1, DSM-4 axis 1 disorder that's related to trauma. There are others as well. But the important point is that the majority of people exposed to even the most catastrophic events tend not to develop stress-related disorders. And I'm interested in those people, although we'll see that post-traumatic growth doesn't happen just in people who seem to be relatively unaffected by trauma, but happens in people who are experiencing PTSD and other kinds of disorders as well. So it's not that post-traumatic growth happens in the absence of symptoms of the aftermath of trauma. It happens together with them. So trauma has struggles and possibilities in it. All traumatic events have certain common elements. There's emotional distress that's associated with these events. Fear, anxiety, sadness, guilt, anger, intrusive images and thoughts. There's various kinds of emotional sequelae as a result of trauma. Cognitive reassessments occur, and this is really a key element in this whole area of post-traumatic growth because it's the challenging or shattering of the assumptive world that is so important in determining how the outcome of these events will affect a person. Ronnie Janoff Bowman wrote a book about shattered assumptions. The basic fundamental ideas we have about how life is going to go for us, what kind of people we are, what kind of world we live in, who is around us. These are assumptions that are so fundamental we hardly question them. But we carry them with us, and only when they come into contact with traumas that call them into question do we even recognize we've been making these assumptions. And the shattering of these assumptions now confront us with the question, how am I going to live? What is my life to be now after all that I've thought was true may not be at all? What I thought was true about myself, the kind of person I am, or the people around me, or the kind of life I'm going to be living. So we make cognitive reassessments in the aftermath of trauma about how benevolent the world is, how predictable it is, how controllable it is, and how vulnerable we are to the events of the world. Are these events that will happen just to other people, or can they happen to us? Now we find out that they do. They do happen to us as well as others. Trauma presents us with behavioral tasks, new roles to fill. Maybe if we have a loved one who has a serious, chronic, debilitating illness, now we're a caregiver when we never were before, and we become nurses where we never thought we would have to do such tasks. If you lose a spouse, now you are a single person rather than a married person. How do you do that after being married many years? That may be difficult to grasp. If you are a person who has been temporarily able-bodied, as they say, and you become disabled, how do you grasp the fact that now you're one of them, not one of the able-bodied bunch? So we have these new circumstances to cope with, and maybe relationships that have to be replaced or changed. All of these things have elements of loss and provide possibilities for long-term psychological problems or for growth. I thought I'd put up here a couple quotes, a few quotes about trauma and its benefits. I collect these kinds of quotes every time I'm reading the newspaper or a book or listening to people. I hear a lot of post-traumatic growth statements, so I collect these, and I've got dozens and dozens. And here are some. This is a common kind of response to trauma among a lot of people. What I've learned mostly is how precious life is and how important friends and family are. This was a statement made by Jim Valvano, who was a basketball coach at North Carolina State University for a number of years and a TV broadcaster who died of cancer. That's what he was talking about here, post-traumatic growth as a result of his bout with cancer. Here's another one. I think God made it happen so people would appreciate each other more. This was a boy who I believe was 10 years old who had witnessed his classmates' deaths when aircraft collided over his school. This is a quote from Newsweek in 1991. So even very young children may try to figure out some benefit in the aftermath of a traumatic event. And in fact, my colleagues and I have worked out a way to try to measure in children some post-traumatic growth, and have done a couple of initial studies with young children to see if post-traumatic growth can occur at these younger ages. The next quote is from the first page of a book that Lawrence Calhoun and I wrote called Trauma and Transformation. And this is a quote from one of the participants in our study of people who had suffered physical disabilities. This young man was a rock and roll musician who had been traveling with his band in a van, and late one night the van crashed and he was severely injured and became paralyzed. And as a result of this, eventually, he quit rock and roll, he quit drugs, he reunited with his family from which he was estranged, went to college, went to graduate school, became a rehabilitation counselor, and a director of an organization in our area that helps with housing for people with different kinds of disabilities. So what he said was about his accident, this was the one thing that happened in my life that I needed to have happen. It was probably the best thing that ever happened to me. On the outside looking in, that's pretty hard to swallow, I'm sure, but hey, that's the way I view it. If I hadn't experienced this and lived through it, I likely wouldn't be here today because of my lifestyle previously. I was on a real self-destructive path. If I had to do it all over again, I would want it to happen the same way. I would not want it not to happen. So he was very pleased, actually, that he had become paralyzed because it led to a life of fulfillment for him. However, not everyone values their trauma like this. Here's another quote about post-traumatic growth that's a little different. This is from Harold Kushner, who wrote the book When Bad Things Happen to Good People. His son, Aaron, died. And he says, I'm a more sensitive person, a more effective pastor, a more sympathetic counselor because of Aaron's life and death than I would ever have been without it. And I would give up all of those gains in a second if I could have my son back. If I could choose, I would forego all of the spiritual growth and depth which has come my way because of our experiences and be what I was 15 years ago, an average rabbi, an indifferent counselor, helping some people and unable to help others, and the father of a bright, happy boy, but I cannot choose. And that's certainly the kind of perspective that I hear from the bereaved parents that I work with. None of them, of course, would be able to say that their child dying was a good thing. And that highlights the fact that what we're talking about here is not that trauma is a good thing. It's what people do in the aftermath of trauma that's important, what they do with it. So we're not celebrating traumatic events and saying that they are good. We're talking about what people do in the aftermath. There's a quote from Helen Keller. So I say my education was accomplished in the tragedy of my teacher's life. She understood the void in my soul because her childhood had been so empty of joy. And here's a favorite I have. This is from Reynolds Price, who is a playwright novelist who had spinal cancer and was paralyzed as a result. And he wrote a book called A Whole New Life. And at one point, this is what he says. Trauma forces a person to be somebody else, the next viable you, a stripped-down, whole-other, clear-eyed person, realistic as a sawed-off shotgun and thankful for air, not to speak of the human kindness you'll meet if you get normal luck. I love that. The next viable you, the next you, a new life. More realistic about life. wiser about it, what life is really about, rather than the assumptions that you had made, the schemas that you had been using beforehand, which encourage you perhaps to think of yourself as invulnerable. It's not just teenagers who do this, you know, who think of themselves as invulnerable. We all do it to some extent. What I'm talking about is nothing new. From ancient times, the story of the human race is of tragedy and transformation. All the religions of the world deal with this. Greek tragedies deal with this. Mythology is full of it. I'm not talking about anything new. I don't claim that. I'm just saying, why haven't traumatologists paid more attention? That's all. So in religion, we find many references to transformations in the aftermath of trauma. Here's one quote from Billy Graham that is quite a nice metaphor, I thought. Suffering, on the other hand, tends to plow up the surface of our lives to uncover the depths that provide greater strength of purpose and accomplishment. Only deeply plowed earth can yield bountiful harvests. And metaphor is very important in talking about this. When you talk to trauma survivors about their experiences, sometimes usual language fails, and you have to use metaphor to get these messages across. So you end up talking these ways very often. So that gives you some ideas of some quotes. Post-traumatic growth tends to fall into 5 domains. And Dr. Bradshaw had mentioned these in the introduction here. When we did our studies of people who had become physically disabled in adulthood, and also talked to many bereaved people, we did qualitative analyses of these interviews, many interviews. And as a result of this, we tried to develop some items that would be representative of the full breadth of changes that people talk about when they talk about changes in the aftermath of trauma. And we developed an instrument called the Post-Traumatic Growth Inventory to try to measure these things in some quantitative fashion. As a result of a factor analysis of this inventory, we arrived at 5 domains of post-traumatic growth. And these simply are reflecting what, again, our trauma survivors had informed us about. One domain is the changed sense of relationship with others. This may be because when you're a trauma survivor, you have to tell a story. You have to talk about this. Almost all trauma survivors have to say something about what's happened to them, to somebody at some point. And as a result of talking about something that is such a life-changing event and is full of so much emotion, people often find themselves disclosing differently than they've ever disclosed before. They have a way of connecting with people unlike what they have done before. And as a result of these disclosures, either they get disappointed in the responses from the other people, or they become closer to the other people they talk to because of the responses they get. So very often you'll find people say, I'm closer to people than I was before. I have this intimacy. I'm more emotionally expressive, more comfortable with my emotions, and that sort of thing. So that's one way that relationship with others has changed. That's a little better. Changed sense of self. More vulnerable, yet stronger. This is one of the paradoxes of post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is full of paradoxes. Here's one, that Vulnerability can be a useful corrective to the unrealistic perception that it can't happen to me. Oh, yes, it has. And the sense that even though I'm vulnerable to things clearly now in a way that I wasn't so sure of before, even though I'm more vulnerable, I also recognize that I'm stronger. I've survived this. I am a survivor. If I can handle this, I can handle anything, is the kind of phraseology that you hear from many trauma survivors. I certainly hear that from my bereaved parents a lot. They say to me, I can't imagine what could be worse than I'm going through. I don't care what it would be. If I had my legs cut off, I would rather that had happened and my child be alive. This is the worst. So if I can survive this, I can survive it. Change sense of the value of life. An appreciation of life, especially for everyday things. Shifts in life priorities. Often the importance of relationships formerly taken for granted. Just earlier this week, I was in a session with a client of mine who has lung cancer, and he's had lung cancer for 5 years and gone through all sorts of chemotherapy, radiation, and whatnot. And just last month, the doctors told him that the clinical trial, experimental clinical trial he was on, was no longer working, and there was nothing more they could do. And so he's in hospice care now and declining. So he's in the last bit of his life, and he says to me, he says, you know what? These 5 years with cancer have been the best years of my life. This is the best time of my life. Why? Because cancer made him change how he related to his family, to his kids and his wife. He's much closer to them than he ever was before. He was this top salesman in his company. He told me, in fact, he says, you know, the other day I had all these plaques, all my sales awards for over the year. I threw them all out. They don't mean anything. It's not what's important. I worked my life for those plaques. But now, you know, he has a relationship with his wife that's better than it's ever been. They were on the verge of divorce before he got cancer. That's how I started working with them. Change in priorities. New possibilities. Because you have to sometimes, in a response to trauma, disengage from goals that are no longer possible, you might pursue something different. That's like the musician who became the rehabilitation counselor. Had to disengage from the other goal of being a musician. Well, he might not have had to, but it would have been hard for him. So a new path operated for him instead. Spiritual development, deepening of one's existential experience, sometimes a modification or development of religious beliefs. Visits to the thin places. The thin places, that's out of Celtic religious experience. It's a description of where you're closest to God, where there's not too much distance between you and the eternal. And trauma also has the effect for many people of bringing them close to death, you know, mortality, and therefore the eternal. Yes?
As I was looking at this, it's like a spiritual awakening. The whole thing is very similar to what happens when one has a spiritual experience.
Absolutely.
All those points that you mentioned are very similar.
That's right, and that's how it feels for people. we can look at all these things, even if we're not trauma survivors, we can look at them and say, oh yes, that's good living, that's what we should be doing, and that all makes sense. But now this is experienced in a whole different way. It's experienced in the bones, It has a different kind of quality to it. It is like a spiritual awakening. So here's a quick glance. You're not going to be able to copy this down. Don't even try. This is the post-traumatic growth inventory. It's got 21 items. It's got these various factors, and certainly I can provide you with this if you're interested in using it. But these are the kinds of things that people are responding to. I'm able to do better things with my life. I put more effort into my relationships. Discover I'm stronger than I thought I was, that kind of thing. So if you're interested in using that for research purposes, I can get a copy to you and be happy to have you use it. Some caveats. Not all persons who experience a particular set of circumstances report post-traumatic growth. It looks like maybe half to 2/3 of people who experience trauma do so in general, not everybody. So we've got that. Post-traumatic growth is not a facile consequence of a bit of stress. What has to happen is traumatic. And for me, that's defined by two things. One is the shattering of the assumptive world, all right? And the second is the change in the narrative of a person's life. People who go through a traumatic event have their lives divided into before and after, before the event and after the event. Some event that has that kind of power is really traumatic. Before my child died, after my child died. Before I got cancer, after I got cancer. Before the war, after the war. Right? Truly traumatic things change the narrative, set it on a different course, turning point, and challenge these basic assumptions about living. It's not just going through a little bit of stress. Okay? Yes? When we did our original study, it was a year or more after the traumatic event. The question about length of time, that reveals post-traumatic is an important one, and we want to discern at what points does this start to happen with people. I think it's a curvilinear relationship where it happens probably for most people within a year or so and tends to decline over time. But we got to do more work to find that out.
The American philosopher talks about broken stories.
Yes. A break in the story, yes. Yes. And so you get used to your narrative, and you're looking at where you think it's going to be going, and then suddenly it's not going there anymore. Yeah.
In order to process trauma, does it have to break or shatter the kinds of assumptions that John Fullman talked about, or can this be lighter kinds of expectations? Because I'm thinking of some people that I've done some work with and done some research with. I don't know if I would consider what they kind of least subjectively as trauma. Breaking up with sort of a short-term relationship, or getting an F on a test, or something like
Yes.
that. But still, you see.
Yes.
I don't know if it's just rationalization. Coming up with benefits.
Yeah.
Quite strong.
Yeah. Trauma is in the eye of the beholder. I think it's very difficult for us to pass judgment on what constitutes trauma for an individual person. For example, in my book, Facilitating Post-Traumatic Growth, where I describe sort of clinical approaches to this, I have a case example of a guy who was a high-powered executive who was out on the road one time and had a liaison with a prostitute. And it just blew his mind that he did this. What in the world is wrong with me? Why did I do this? He started fearing he had AIDS. It created a whole series of questions in him about himself. All right? So most people would not think necessarily that that's a traumatic event, but for him it was. How he responded to it was with post-traumatic growth.
But that is a confrontation with death.
Yes, in a way.
One of the criteria for trauma
Yeah.
is the DSM.
Yeah.
But you're saying actually that's not necessarily the criteria you're using for trauma.
Right.
But this is just something that shatters some sort of subjective assumption.
Yes, yes. So traumas can have many negative psychological consequences that for some people can last the rest of their lives. So we're not saying that just because there's growth, there's no more negative consequences. And people who do not experience trauma also report post-traumatic growth, okay? There is, to some degree, a self-enhancing cognitive bias that we all have that we're continuing to develop and grow and change and get better. I'm getting better and better every day, you know, that kind of notion about ourselves. So I think that's also the case along with the growth that happens as a result of traumatic events. Exactly, then it would be post-traumatic. But people talk about growth anyway. Trauma isn't the only route to it. Yes. So we've got the self-enhancing bias, and maybe what happens, the way that works is people make downward comparisons to their life before trauma. They devalue their life before trauma and say that isn't as good as where I am now. There's a lot of debate in the literature right now over how post-traumatic growth works and to what extent there are these kinds of biases involved. Okay. Let me, yes?
Would that be considered a negative thing because of self-enhancing or, can be sort of not realistic? Could that be negative in that sense, that the person sees something about herself that is not realistic? Or is it just leaving?
Well, one of the questions about post-traumatic growth is to what degree are the self-reports of post-traumatic growth valid? Because it's interesting how little post-traumatic growth is related to when you do a lot of measurement. It's not very well related to psychological adjustment, for example. The reports that people have that they've gotten better are sometimes hard to validate because much of this is happening internally and may be hard to observe in terms of behavior. But for some people, it's very clear that their behavior has changed. So it's a variety of things here. And you also have to consider that most of the studies we have right now are snapshots in time, are cross-sectional studies. We have to have longitudinal studies to see how people change over a period of time. Maybe some of the cognitive changes in a lot of people haven't resulted in some of the behavioral changes yet. Okay. Let me just show you very quickly another a way of looking at this process of post-traumatic growth. And this is from a growth. We start off with the person pre-trauma. It seems that kinds of for whom post-traumatic growth is most likely to occur. That's the moderate well-being. They an open FIO, five-factor inventory of personality. We've got data on that. They're extroverted. They have some schema that might result in some development after the trauma. And then they hit the traumatic event that seismic rocks their world. It's an earthquake for their assumptive world. And as a result, there are challenges to the higher order schemas, higher order beliefs, the basic assumptive world that I mentioned to you, and their ability to manage emotional distress. What has happened is so distressing that they feel unable to cope very well with it. Sets in motion some automatic rumination as people struggle to figure out, what am I going to do? What's happened? Oh, this is awful. What's going on here? What's wrong with me? And if people achieve some kind of coping success, they can disengage from unreachable goals and untenable beliefs and decrease their emotional distress. To a great degree, this is because of the influence of some social support. And Zippy will talk more about this in a study she'll present to you in just a few minutes. Because social support can be a source of some comfort, some new schemas, new ways to think of this, and new ways to cope. So coping success can be related to social support. And then things get a little bit more interesting. As long as people have some basic success in managing their emotions, then they can engage in some rumination that's more deliberate than automatic. They can really start to think, what does this mean for me? Where's my life going to go now? In what way should I change? What are my new priorities, etc.? And from this you get post-traumatic growth, narrative development, and wisdom. All these things are related, I think. People have to change their narrative about their life, as I mentioned to you, after notion. And as they do so, they produce some of these changes in these 5 dimensions of growth, and also appreciate things in a wise way. If you look at some of the work on wisdom by Paul Baltes, for example, he emphasizes the notion that wise people can appreciate paradox and engage in dialectical thinking. The basic paradox, of course, of post-traumatic growth is that something has been gained from loss. In loss, there has been gained. That's the basic paradox. There are other ones that people start to appreciate as a result of having gone through trauma. For example, trauma is in the past, and you have to put it in the past and leave it, but it is always with you. It is in the present and in your future. It is woven into the fabric of your life from now on. A paradox. It's over with, but not really. It's still with me in my story and in how I'm going to run my life. There's the paradox of having to do something to cope with trauma, yet sometimes not doing is very important. Just being still and accepting this is important. There's the paradox of having to seek the social support to manage this well and to figure out how to go through trauma, and maybe as a result of social support also being inspired towards some growth. But despite sharing it with other people and connecting with other people, surviving trauma is something that you end up having to do by yourself. Another paradox. There are all these paradoxes that seem to be involved in the wisdom that develops out of post-traumatic growth. Baltes, B-A-L-T-E-S. He's a German psychologist. and it's written quite a lot on wisdom and aging. So, if we have a summary of the experience of growth, some change has taken place in the view of the self or the world. This change is perceived to result in a more profound understanding of the self and the world. It allows for changes in behavior that is seen to be effective in warding off future distress, engaging in activities previously unconsidered or untried, providing rewards previously unobtained. What is lost is devalued or transformed into a more valuable present. And the changes that occurred are possible because of the struggle with the challenges presented by the trauma. Right? Not the trauma itself, but the challenges presented by the trauma. I want to say just a couple words before I turn it over to Zippy about intervening to facilitate post-traumatic growth. Principles of intervention with trauma survivors. And I'm going through this very quickly. If you're interested in this in depth, my book with Lawrence Calhoun on facilitating post-traumatic growth expands on all of this stuff. So you can't do this without being a good clinician, being able to listen well, all those things that Don Meichenbaum talked about in terms of the therapeutic alliance and whatnot. That's basic. But you need to know something about the kind of trauma your client is dealing with. If you're seeing people with cancer, you need to know something about what they mean when they mention different treatments and what happens in their form of cancer and things like that. That's useful. If you're working with bereaved parents, you're going to need to know something about that. But don't be an expert on the trauma. You don't need to be. You've got the expert with you. They'll teach you the kinds of things you need to know. But some basic information is important. So post-traumatic growth therapy may be a new perspective, but it's not a new treatment. The last thing we need in psychology and psychotherapy is a new form of psychotherapy. Lord knows we don't need another one, okay? And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about just integrating this perspective into what you do as a good clinician. So all trauma treatment tends to include certain elements. You have to help people become safe, to become desensitized to the things that are arousing to them. You have to engage in the narrative development, develop the story of the trauma and what has happened since then. And you have to work on these change schemas that really are what we're talking about with post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth is integrated into these aspects of treatment. The clinician cannot create growth, and there's no formula for it, and clients take different routes to it. So you have to be very open. You have to tolerate the client's own framework, what Shelley Taylor has called positive illusions, a term I hate. But you have to recognize that people, all of us, have illusions of one sort or another. Our lives are running on these illusions about things. And so trauma survivors are no more doing this than anybody else. And you need to be willing to explore spiritual or religious views. You have to be comfortable in talking about spirituality and religion to work with trauma survivors. It's almost always part of the experience. Especially with people who have come near death themselves or in bereavement experiences. For example, a father who was an atheist who realized after his son died that he was thinking of his son as being in heaven. And if he was thinking of his son as being in heaven, well, that must mean there's some sort of God. And if there's some sort of God, maybe I'm not an atheist. And if there's some sort of God, maybe I better take a look at how I'm living. All of this, you see, follows from that experience of bereavement. You have to be willing to talk about those kinds of things. So you focus on listening without necessarily trying to solve. And this is what I recommend. Listen in a way that allows change in yourself rather than be intent on doing the changing. Try to allow the person you're working with to change you. I feel like that has happened with me a lot in this work over the past decades. That has changed me. Allow yourself to be changed by the trauma survivors. Don't think that you have the answers. Mostly you sit there and recognize you don't have any answers, and you can, at least I feel, very, very naive sometimes. So that's easy for me. But notice the growth as the client approaches it. Reinforce it. Reinforce reasonable, positive interpretations of growth. Clients will mention things that you can bring to the surface. Guard against the platitudes about what wonderful opportunities traumas are. All right? Don't do that kind of thing. Are some events too horrible? I don't think so. It's amazing the kinds of horrible events people have told me about that they still see as provoking some kind of growth. You can say some people I've worked with have said that they have changes in positive ways as they cope with their trauma. Do you think that this is possible for you given the kinds of things you went through? Just ask that question. Just putting it out there encourages them to consider that. In my bereavement support groups, these parents don't know what I do, and they don't care. They come in, they've got other things in their mind. They haven't read my books or anything. But they sit there and they often talk about these kinds of transformative changes. They bring it up themselves. I say, oh, really? They bring it up. Encourage contact with veterans of similar traumas. I'm really a believer in group experiences in treating trauma because the veterans have the credibility. And Zippy will talk more about that in just a minute. I'm going to jump ahead to one last thing. Vicarious post-traumatic growth. Working with trauma survivors can change you. Being around people who have experienced trauma can change you. It can allow you to become a better clinician because you can learn about trauma and recovery. You'll learn more about human nature through the honesty of the trauma response. You know, that's one of the reasons I like working with bereaved parents, because these people are hurting so badly, they can't be anything but honest. They can't put on any kind of shields and facades anymore. It gets difficult to do that. So there's honesty there. You can appreciate their life situation, appreciate human strength. You can turn the insights you have achieved into advocacy. And I feel like I've done that with bereaved parents. I feel like I'm an advocate for them. I feel very deeply about them. If you're looking for some resources, here's some things that Lawrence Calhoun and I have published, and I can give you a list if you're interested in reading anything. If I might just mention, again, the book Facilitating Post-Traumatic Growth, that's a clinical application. The book Trauma and Transformation is the first one we wrote, which is, I think, a pretty good overview of the field if you're looking to get introduced to it. The 1996 article is where the post-traumatic growth inventory is located. The book, 1998, Posttraumatic Growth, Positive Changes Aftermath of Crisis, is an edited version. We've got chapters in there written by a number of people who've done research in this area. And the last one is an article that I wrote which applies these concepts to post-traumatic growth in societies, how societies can change as a result of confronting trauma, which I think is an important thing for us to be looking at these days. So now what I'm going to do is turn this over to Zippy Weiss, who will talk with you about how to apply a lot of these concepts, how she applied a lot of these concepts to her work with breast cancer survivors and their spouses.